Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and major strategic partners of India, which are helping India become a leading power in the world. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up a very pivotal country that matters to India, to Asia, and to the world. This is Japan. We are talking about the rise of Japan, the resurgence of Japan, and the return of Japan as a major player in the geopolitics of Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And to discuss this, I am very privileged to introduce you to a learned scholar from Japan who has joined us in the studio today, Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Sato is a professor and dean at the College of Asia Pacific Studies at the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Oita, Japan, and is in India and engaging with the stakeholders here. So it's an honor for us, Professor Sato, to have you here in Doordarshan.
Thank you very much.
Professor Sato, return or resurgence of Japan is the most talked about phenomenon in Asia in recent years, especially since the second term of late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2012. There has been a definite shift in Japanese military doctrine, in foreign policy, in a more assertive direction. And watching from a distance here in India, it feels like finally Japan has come back or arrived on the scene, because earlier it was seen as missing and focused only on economic development. But now with this more assertive posture, it seems to be changing the dynamics in Asia. So I'd like you to begin by reflecting on why this change has happened in the last decade or so, and what are the forces propelling this push towards a more assertive Japan?
Okay, I think we need to go back to the end of the Cold War to see the start of this process. Japan took the US-Japan alliance for more or less granted during the Cold War period. But when the Cold War ended, a lot of things became uncertain, including the prospect of China. The United States was initially very optimistic about the future course of China. And in Japan, I think the opinions were somewhat polarized about the prospect of China. There were always conservative elements who thought that China is going to be the next threat, whereas others who were more optimistic thought that the economic interdependence will tame China. And I think the more pessimistic view turned out to be true, unfortunately.
Since the Xi Jinping era, definitely China has moved in a very aggressive direction, and I've heard both Prime Ministers Abe and Kishida saying that this is the most complex security environment Japan has faced in a long time. So I think they're basically obliquely referring to this China factor, which is a primary concern. And your military spending, Professor Sato, also has been hiked, and we have been watching very closely the goal of 2% of GDP. And Japan is, a major economy in the world,
Right.
And for 2% means a lot in terms of the outlay. The projections are for around $330 billion US dollars by 2027. That's how much they are allocating for defense now. And counter-strike capabilities, missiles, and all these things which earlier, these Japanese self-defense forces were seen to be mostly defensive, but now it looks like they are in a position to be able to shape the regional security order with more capabilities. So please tell the audience about Japan rearming and rebuilding its military capabilities, which had been lying asleep for a long time.
Right. Yeah, the Prime Minister Kishida announced that Japan will gradually increase the defense spending, and the 2% figure came from the basically the same standard as the European allies of the United States. Within the NATO framework, Europeans committed to this 2% figure, and Japan basically toed the line. But at the same time, we have to be careful to assess this the so-called doubling of the defense budget, because there will be a change in the kind of accounting of the security-related budget. So currently, for example, Coast Guard budget, which has been increasing due to the growing threat around the disputed Senkaku Islands, has been increasing because of this threat. But the Coast Guard budget is under the civilian budget of the Ministry of the Land and Transportation. So this will be changed to kind of security the budget and counted toward the 2%. So some of that is going to be old wine in a new bottle, in a sense. And on top of that, Japan will have to procure some large, strictly defensive items. And for example, the big capital ship for missile defense. And that's going to be in line. And those things will take up a lot of the budget increase. So it's probably misleading to think that the bulk of the defense increase will be geared toward the more assertive and offensive capabilities.
But still, the power projection definitely, it goes without saying that a country with more military hardware and more advanced weaponry will be able to project power and in the region. And we often hear, Japanese leaders talking about how they want to secure the entire Indo-Pacific and to play a bigger role in supporting free and open Indo-Pacific and all that. So I think the so-called build-up, the military build-up, is intended to create that balance of power in the region, isn't it?
Yes, of course. The Japanese the defense build-up is primarily geared toward the defensive posture in the East Asian region, and it's the Japan's converting, for example, some of the destroyer ships, flat deck destroyer ships, which used to be primarily for anti-submarine warfare, but now it's being converted into a small aircraft carrier to equip with the F-35B. That's a vertically capable fighter planes. And so things like that happening, but they are primarily for the defensive purposes because, small aircraft carrier, it cannot be really projected effectively to distant areas, unlike the, real big aircraft carrier the United States has. So basically it's a regional role. And I think the part of the growing activities are taking place in, for example, the South China Sea, and the Chinese threat in this region is being deterred by, the joint exercise between Japan, Australia, U.S., and lately I think the Philippines also are cooperating very closely with these countries.
Absolutely. So viewers, Japan is becoming quote unquote a normal power again, from being just an economic superpower. It's now also acquiring military might, and that is something seen as very positive by most of its allies and friendly countries in the region. But then what is the ultimate purpose? It is the free and open Indo-Pacific, and that is the goal. So we had Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan here in New Delhi earlier in 2023 talking about his vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. Let's catch a glimpse of what Prime Minister Kishida said.
With the changing paradigm in international relations and in the current situation where there is no consensus on what should be the underlying perspective for the next era, FOIP is a vision that is in fact gaining in relevance. In this sense, FOIP was a visionary concept. In particular, the concept of FOIP has been flexible in evolving in a way that embraces various voices, along with the growing support and endorsement from the international community. I believe that this vision, nurtured by the voices of different countries, and which can be characterized as our FOIP, is becoming more important than ever toward the goal of leading the international community in the direction of cooperation rather than division and confrontation. Even at this turning point, the fundamental concept of FOIP remains the same. It is simple. We will enhance the connectivity of the Indo-Pacific region, foster the region into a place that values freedom, the rule of law, free from force or coercion, and make it prosperous. With this backdrop, we should reaffirm and share the understanding that at the root of the concept of FOIP is defending freedom and the rule of law.
So, viewers, the Prime Minister of Japan saying FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, is all about defending freedom and the rule of law. Professor Sato, Japan is not only talking about the in crude terms like balance of power, but also about creating a normative environment in the Indo-Pacific,
right,
which is free and democratic and based on rules-based conduct. And obviously, the Chinese expansion and aggression has been the main challenge to this idea of a rules-based order. What we have seen with in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, and here in South Asia as well. So, on that count, let's now focus a little bit on what we call the external balancing aspect of Japanese foreign policy. We already spoke about the internal balancing, which is based on military buildup. But when it comes to external balancing, which is mainly in the form of alliances and partnerships, how do you think Japan has adjusted its core alliances? I mean, as you know, it's a U.S. treaty ally for a long time, and it's also built, I think, closer links now with NATO, even though it's not formally part of NATO. So let's talk a bit about the alliances and then come to the strategic partnerships where India comes in. But let's start with Japan's formal alliances. And how has these alliances been upgraded in recent years and adjusted to meet this growing Chinese challenge?
Yeah, Japan tried to feature the alliance in terms of domestic politics as American obligation to defend Japan, and try to minimize the aspect of Japanese contribution to U.S. security. And that is because of the previous government's interpretation of the Constitution, which basically took a position that the Constitution doesn't ban collective defense, but as a cabinet decision, Japan has been refraining from exercising the rights to collective defense. So from that perspective, the government has minimized what Japan can do for American security. But the post-Cold War environment is different. The U.S. needs Japan because of its geostrategic location, very important location. But at the same time, the change in weaponry is really making those frontline bases vulnerable to surprise attack, and Americans are shifting some of the defense assets back to Guam and Hawaii, and this is causing a dilemma for Japan in the sense that the credibility of the alliance to some feels being reduced. And because of that, Japan needs to demonstrate that its utility to the US-Japan alliance is getting a boost. And the constitutional reinterpretation has something to do with it. Japan can now, for example, engage in kind of combat missions in the event some of the U.S. the vessels or aircraft coming to the rescue of Japan is attacked, then Japan can shoot back against the hostile states. So that kind of a reinterpretation has taken place.
And Professor Sato, talking of this collective defense posture, now presumably if there is a war over Taiwan, Japan, the southern islands of Japan, Okinawa, they are very close to Taiwan. And so people are asking whether Japan will actually fight to defend Taiwan, and that's a very fundamental question. What is the state of the debate on this matter in Japan right now?
There are some politicians within the ruling party also who are openly talking about the need for Japan to militarily engage if the conflict erupts. But the government's official position is to keep the present ambiguity on this very question.
And Professor, let's talk now about the wider set of partnerships. I mean, apart from the US alliance, Japan has become very proactive in terms of building ties with Australia, with India, with the ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam and Philippines. And Japan has also changed its policy with regard to weapons exports and what they call security assistance to countries in the Indo-Pacific. And many countries are feeling very hopeful about it because Japan is technologically a very advanced nation, and together with its own military, if it can also help to be a net security provider to others in the region, especially in the maritime domain, that will really help, isn't it? So how has that thinking come about, and which countries do you think are the main focus areas for Japan for building these strategic partnerships now?
I see. Yeah, there are two drivers on this, and one is that Japan feels it has to be more active in security policy, and rather than just building up its own capability, helping the friendly states' capability, which can be used for deterring, aggressor states in the region, is a very important part of foreign policy for Japan. But the second aspect of this is that Japan has been trying to keep a high level of defense-related technology in the hands of the indigenous defense corporations. And those companies, without the export market, the market is limited to the Japanese the self-defense force procurement, which is rather small. And because of that, the production has not been very efficient. The cost is high, and they need to expand the market. And that's the second driver of this. And I think Japan will have a really difficult time because Japan is new to this the defense export area, and even the friendly allies are competitors in that sense, the US, France, and others. Right. So Japan wants to work on this. And recently there has been discussions with India and Vietnam and Indonesia and some other countries. But oftentimes the cost issue is a significant barrier against the Japanese prospective exporters.
Yeah. But the fact that there's one more player is good news, because our vision of a multipolar Asia becomes stronger when Japan is playing an active role in defense of the region. Now, Professor Sato, let's focus a little bit on the other strategic partnerships and the regions, the sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific. Japan has always been a big development partner for the Pacific Island nations and for ASEAN countries and in South Asia. And these three sub-regions, which are critical for the Indo-Pacific, they seem to be places where we are getting more Japanese interest now and involvement. So that's seems like Japan, like I said, was missing in action, but is now come back there. And all these regions wanted Japan as a balancer to their to the Chinese presence and their domination, including in economic and infrastructure. So those areas, I think this is a big role that Japan can play, isn't it?
Yeah, Japan has played a very important role for development of this broad region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Island states as well. But when China came up with the Belt and Road Initiative, Japan was eclipsed by China in terms of the amount of money both countries were providing to the region. The Chinese money was simply huge in terms of the promises they made, although not all of the promises came true. So in that sense, I think we will see some narrowing of this the quantitative gap. But at the same time, Japan's trying to counter China by promoting the so-called quality assistance and
Infrastructure, especially. Yeah,
that's right. So in that sense, you might want to say Japan is back to the region.
Point well taken. Viewers, now coming to India and the Indian Ocean, I have interesting comments by India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar in the United States, talking about China's naval expansion into the Indian Ocean and how India is responding. Let's hear that and come back to the discussion.
If one were to look at the last 20, 25 years, there's been a steady increase in the Chinese naval presence and activity in the Indian Ocean. But there's been a very sharp increase in the size of the Chinese Navy. So when you have a very much bigger Navy, that Navy is going to be obviously visible in terms of its deployment somewhere. I guess when you come out of the east coast of China, you either go into the Pacific or you turn westwards and come into the Indian Ocean. Now, in our own case, we have seen Chinese port activity, port building. You mentioned Gwadar. There's a port called Hambantota in Sri Lanka. There are a few others. Now, in many cases, I would say, looking back, maybe the governments of the day, the policymakers of the day, perhaps underestimated the importance of this and how these ports could work in future. Each one is a little unique in a way, certainly, we obviously do watch, many of them very carefully for any security implications that they have for us. So, from an Indian point of view, I would say it's very reasonable for us to try and actually prepare for a far greater Chinese presence than we have seen before.
So viewers, India's External Affairs Minister saying far greater Chinese presence in our backyard than before, and we are preparing for it, and we are watching the ports, the strategic, the so-called string of pearls that the Chinese have built. Professor Sato, Japan, like you said, the orientation is towards the Pacific, but looking westwards, our minister was talking about how the Chinese Navy is going in both directions. They're trying to push the US or push the boundaries in the Pacific, but also come into the Indian Ocean. They have the two ocean strategy, as the Chinese call, the PLA calls it. So what can Japan do to enable and to support India, which is historically been like the dominant power in the Indian Ocean, but is also now on the defensive because of encroachment and infiltration by the Chinese? How can Japan and India cooperate, you think?
Okay. Well, the Indian Ocean region has always been on Japan's kind of security interest, and that's primarily because Japan's heavy dependence on trade, either into the Persian Gulf region or through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. So Japan has always been interested, but during the Cold War, the Soviet threat in the Indian Ocean region was quite limited, and the U.S. Seventh Fleet was quite dominant in this region. So Japan didn't do much, but Japan has been gradually increasing its own presence in the region since, for example, 9/11, after the Al-Qaeda attack against the United States. Japan dispatched destroyers and refueler ships into this Indian Ocean region to work with the coalition partners. And Japan's anti-piracy operation in the Sea of Aden is also still taking place as well. So the growing presence is visible, and Japan also anticipates, seeking more access points in the region. And currently there is a first Japanese overseas base in Djibouti. And if Japan can have more access points, that would encourage closer cooperation between Japan, India, and also probably a third party throughout the region.
Absolutely. So viewers, the port construction is a matter of great concern for us. The Chinese are building and acquiring strategic real estate all across the Indian Ocean region and trying to surround India or to get alternative access to Indian Ocean bypassing the Malacca Straits. These are big geostrategic moves by the Chinese, but together with close strategic and global partners like Japan, we can potentially roll this back and also develop our own access points, as Professor Sato is talking about, where our navies can also operate and be able to deter the Chinese pressure. I want to thank Professor Yoichiro Sato for sharing such invaluable insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here.
So viewers, Japan is rising again, and there have been many iterations of this all the way since the 19th century, if you look at it. But what we are seeing in the first half of the 21st century is going to be different, because Japan is a democratic country today, and it is surrounded by a major authoritarian adversary, China, and to a lesser extent North Korea. But Japan is now alert to the threats that it faces and does not want to get marginalized. That is the sum of the discussion. And India comes in because India helps Japan to increase the ambit of its influence in the Indo-Pacific. So together, Japan and India, we can potentially create the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is the vision of our leaders. Let's keep an eye on FOIP, and Japan's increasing assertiveness in this region and how it's a positive force for good. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.